All right, so you know that classic Christmas card image, right? The three wise men at the manger. Well, what if I told you there's way more to that story? Today, we're going to treat this like a historical cold case, dusting for prints and digging into the ancient sources to figure out what really happened with the Magi.
Yep, this is the scene. Three kings, a stable, a brand new baby. I mean, it's the image of Christmas, right? It's completely burned into our collective memory.
But here's the thing. If you actually go back and read the original account in the Gospel of Matthew, it feels less like a cozy fairy tale and a lot more like a detective novel. Seriously, it's packed with all these little clues that suggest the story is way more complex and frankly more fascinating than the one we usually tell.
Okay, first things first in our investigation. Let's get our lead suspects under the microscope. Who exactly were these wise men? Because, spoiler alert, the story we think we know might be the very first clue that we've been looking in completely the wrong direction.
And the first surprise? It's the name itself. The word magi, it was never ever a synonym for king, not even close. It actually comes from a Babylonian term, and it referred to this highly respected, almost priestly class of intellectuals. We're talking scholars and astronomers from ancient Persia. And listen, this wasn't just some random group of smart guys. Think of them more like a highly organized think tank or a university faculty with specialized departments. You had interpreters of sacred texts, exorcists, healers, and, this is the crucial part for our story, the Gezerim, the astronomers, the ones who read the stars.
Okay, ready for another twist? The Bible never says how many there were, not once. It just says Magi from the East. So, where in the world did we get the number 3? And what about the names we all know? Caspar, Melchior, and Balthazar.
Well, it turns out that early tradition connected the dots. People linked the number of magi to the 3 gifts they brought. But it became something even more powerful than that. They started to be seen as representatives of the 3 known continents of the ancient world: Asia, Africa, and Europe. I mean, what a beautiful, powerful symbol, right? The entire world, all of humanity, coming on this search. All right, let's move on to the next piece of evidence, because this is where the case really starts to build. So if they weren't just randomly following a bright light on a whim, how did they know where to go and when to go? And maybe most importantly, who they were even looking for. Yeah, this was no random star chasing. These guys were the absolute furthest thing from hobbyist stargazers. Their journey, you gotta see it as the final step in this incredibly meticulous, multi-generational investigation. They were following a trail of prophetic breadcrumbs, clues left behind in ancient texts that their order had been studying for centuries. So, Exhibit A, we have this incredibly ancient prophecy from their own neck of the woods, spoken by a guy named Balaam. And get this, we're talking almost 1,400 years before the event. And it explicitly says a star will come out of Jacob and a scepter will rise out of Israel. It directly connects a new ruler with a star. For the Magi, this wasn't just some old story. This was like their professional brief. This was their assignment. And then there's Exhibit B. It comes from the prophet Daniel. And here's the kicker. Daniel wasn't just some random prophet. He was actually appointed as the chief of all the wise men. He was the boss of the Magi, and he had foretold this heavenly event that would announce a new king, a son of man. So basically, they had inside information from their own former leader. Talk about a hot tip. So you see, they weren't just astrologers looking up at the sky. They were also theologians looking back through history. They were the ones connecting the dots between these ancient scrolls and what was happening in their own time. It was a mission that required deep scholarship, sure, but also profound faith. Okay, now we get to the biggest twist in the entire investigation. And I'm not kidding, this might actually change how you set up your nativity scene from now on. Because the scene of the crime, the location of their famous meeting, it wasn't where we've all been told it was. See, when you lay out the evidence from the 2 main accounts, Luke's gospel and Matthew's gospel, it's like looking at 2 different witness statements. The timelines just don't seem to match up with a traditional story. Luke talks about shepherds visiting a newborn in a manger. But Matthew? He says the Magi visited a child, not a newborn, in a house, not a stable. And in an investigation like this, those little details, they matter a lot. So if we carefully reconstruct the timeline, a very different picture emerges. The birth happens in Bethlehem, sure. Then around day 40, they go to the temple in Jerusalem. But after that, they would have gone back to their actual home in Nazareth. And it seems like it was months later when the Magi finally arrived. And where did they find them? Not at a stable in Bethlehem, but at the family's house in Nazareth. This all happens right before the family has to suddenly flee to Egypt.
So you might be thinking, wait, what about the 2-year journey? That's a good question. That whole idea comes from King Herod's absolutely horrific order to kill all the baby boys who were 2 years old and under. But that was most likely just a paranoid, cruel king casting a really wide net to make sure he got his target. I mean, if you do the math, a journey of about 1,800 kilometers by camel caravan, even if you factor in rest days, you're looking at a trip of less than 3 months. No way it took 2 years.
So, we've got the who, the how, and the where pretty much sorted. And that brings us to the climax of our whole investigation, the motive, the why. Why was this meeting so important? Why does any of this matter? And the answer, believe it or not, is in the gifts. It's not just that they brought gifts, it's what they brought. These weren't just random, expensive presents. No, each one was a carefully chosen, deeply symbolic, and honestly, a prophetic statement. Okay, check this out. Each gift was a deliberate declaration. First, gold. That's the kind of tribute you give to a king, right? So they were acknowledging his royalty. Then, frankincense. This was a special incense used by priests during worship in the temple. So with that, they were acknowledging his divinity, that he was God. And then there's myrrh. This one is startling. It was an embalming spice used for burials. It was a prophecy of his humanity and of his future suffering and death. So in just 3 gifts, they proclaimed him King, God, and Savior. Wow. So now that we've kind of cracked this ancient case, what's the big takeaway? With all these details corrected, what does this story really truly mean for us today? I think the real profound meaning lies in who these men were. They were outsiders, foreigners from a different land, a different faith. In a way, they represent all of us, all of humanity. Their long journey is a symbol for every person, from every nation, race, and background, who is on that spiritual search for truth. And that's why their story is such a profound spiritual reflection. It shows that a sincere search for the divine, one that uses your head and your heart, one that's guided by evidence and by faith, well, it doesn't just end with you having all the answers. It's not about intellectual satisfaction. The text says that when they finally found him, they rejoiced with exceedingly great joy. The end of their long intellectual journey was worship. And really, in the end, their quest is kind of a mirror for our own, isn't it? It challenges every one of us to ask, where is my journey leading me? My search for knowledge, for truth, for meaning. What's the destination? Because the story of the Magi reminds us that the greatest journeys aren't measured in miles, but in the transformation of the human heart.